guys, welcome to another discussion episode right here at the APVA Awards 2023. It's a pleasure to be here again. Of course, this is where we talk about interesting stuff about the podcasting, voiceover, and spoken word industry in Africa. And in this series of interviews that you've been listening to this time around, we're looking at something that cuts across all fields. If you're a voiceover artist, a podcaster, a spoken word artist, I'm sure one time or the other, you've dealt with this creativity, in terms of having multiple interests in different fields. So we thought, let's talk about this in this discussant episode. Let's find someone who is very super creative and has been able to navigate creativity across multiple fields of interest. And we talk about it. So in this discussant episode, we'll be discussing navigating creativity across multiple fields of interest. My name is T-Code, as I said before, and my guest for today is a very creative personality. He's an engineer, he's a writer, an editor, a speaker, a content strategist, an entrepreneur. I'm talking about no other person than Kojo Baffoe. Hi, Kojo. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I look forward to a very interesting conversation, knowing that you've gone through different scapes of creativity, and you've also lived in different places, like we're talking about before. We jumped on this a session.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that possibly from a lot of my stumbles,
Yeah,
there'll be some wisdom in there, because it's a lot of stumbling to find your place and find your path. And yes, I'm based in South Africa now. I've been here for the last 20 or so years. I grew up in Lesotho, and my father's originally Ghanaian, hence my name, is as typical Ghanaian as you can get, I think, as a name. And he lived in Europe, lived in Germany, and lived in Uganda, and a short stint in Ghana before settling in Lesotho.
And now you're in Johannesburg, South Africa. So you've experienced Africa, from different parts of the continent, and you've also been involved in different creative endeavors. Can you give us a little bit of what that has been like for you, your creative history, if I may say, and what you're presently doing right now?
Yeah, it's a long journey of kind of going different directions. So from a creativity perspective, I got into poetry as a very young child. So I wrote poetry as kind of my therapy, because I was always encouraged to write my thoughts. Because when thoughts are sitting in your head, it can get very messy and very chaotic with a lot of noise. And so my father always taught me that if you write it down, you're able to then kind of articulate it and create some sense out of everything else that's attached to it. So from a creative perspective, I wrote poetry for many years, but I didn't actually study that. So I did a Bachelor of Commerce, and I did economics, marketing, and business administration. And my father had different businesses, including a management consulting company. So that's I grew up in the business world to a certain extent. And the poetry was more an outlet. And I love music, although I can't create it. But I was always drawn to music. I was always drawn to film, just different creative exploits. And when I moved to South Africa, I'd say the real start of my journey in the creative sector was discovering a burgeoning poetry scene and starting to perform and being very involved in that. And I started running shows. I eventually published 2 collections of poetry myself, and was very involved in the scene from that perspective. And then started kind of delving into television. I had a cousin of mine who had a production company. And because I can write, and because of my business background, as well as kind of that balance between business and creative writing, I started writing a lot of TV concepts for it. And then eventually produced for television, did research for television, produced for television. and at the same time started writing for various publications in South Africa. And my family also had a newspaper in Lesotho. So I was also writing. I was involved in running the newspaper, but also writing for the newspaper. So I had a column, and that was kind of my let's call it my training ground. And from there, I went into magazine, and I was writing for magazines, and I started editing a magazine. So I've edited 3 magazines. One a lifestyle magazine, the other a business and lifestyle magazine, and then a lifestyle magazine again, all with a focus on South Africa and then the continent, because I was also raised by a Pan-Africanist. I was raised by a Ghanaian who grew up in Nkrumah's time. So that's been a thread that runs through my life, and runs through how I try to approach anything that I do. And then from magazine, also when the internet started, so I had a MySpace, had multiple MySpace profiles. So for those of you old enough to remember that, before everything else, there was MySpace.
Yeah.
I was also on Blogger. So I was always fascinated by platforms. And I was fascinated by platforms and where you can tell stories. And then also ended up in radio. So I had a radio talk show, as well as I was doing training for the news team at the radio station in terms of being able to create content for online, and also then producing video for the station. So that's kind of been that's a very long life.
Yeah, it is.
Condensed down in terms of what I'm doing now. I Yeah, I'm never sure. I'm never sure. When people ask you, what do you do? And it's never been something that I could answer, because I've always done different things. And so right now I consult for companies and brands, and on content and editorial strategy for for corporate, for brands, etc. I have a client based in Europe, and I've built a network of writers across Africa and now Asia, who contribute to their site there in the global health space. So I run that as a network. So I built this network of I sent an email out to everybody recently, and it was over 70 people. So I built this network of writers. And then I have my podcast. I started my podcast 2 years ago as something that I always wanted to do. So I procrastinated for about 8 years
Wow.
in terms of starting my podcast, because the equipment wasn't, I didn't have the necessary equipment, or I didn't have the necessary skills, or will anybody listen to it? So I had all the excuses that you'll have. So I have my podcast, and then I write for one or two websites. I recently, 2 years ago, also I had a book published, just kind of my reflections on life and the lessons I've learned. And then, I'm a driver for my children. That feels like my main job right now.
Oh my.
I have a teenage son and a preteen daughter, and a lot of my life seems to be driving people to places and waiting for people.
Interesting. I mean, that's a very beautiful way to end it. Some way, somehow, we find ourselves doing many things. I think the beautiful thing is that we're interested in them and we're happy doing them. And that brings me to my next question. There are many things that many creatives can find happiness doing, but there's that question of, what should I do? What should I focus my attention on? Obviously, some pay more than others. So sometimes there's the struggle of, should I go for what is going to pay me more? Or should I go for just my passion, which might not pay me as much? And sometimes you find yourself in a dilemma where your passions don't seem to pay as much as something that is not your passion. So the question is, how do you place a balance, in trying to settle for what you're going to explore your creativity on as part of the things that you can do or you enjoy to do? Looking at the present day economy, where you also need to prioritize making money, but then you want to be happy doing what you love to do. So how do you find that balance?
Look, firstly, I don't know if, I mean, I haven't found that balance. I don't know if there's a balance to it. But it's tied to, so for me, it's tied to how you design your life, right? And like you're saying, we have demands on us from a financial perspective, from an emotional perspective, from a social perspective. And we have to balance that out with some of the things that we want to do because we love them or enjoy them or are passionate about them, etc. What I have done, and it's taken me a long time to do that, is one, compartmentalizing things, two, knowing that I'm not going to be able to do everything, and being comfortable with that. Because sometimes we have all of these ideas and we have all of these things, and we end up putting ourselves under pressure because we feel the need to do all of them, and that's literally impossible. So it's also accepting the fact that I'm not going to be able to do everything, and then it's a more personal thing, deciding which ones you're going to do. And the balance is in, for me, the balance is in things that I do to ensure that I can keep a roof over my head, food on the table, I can take my children to school. I also like nice things, so some of the nice things that I want, I can get those. So there are things that I do and projects that I work on and tasks that I have that are about that. They're purely about me making a living. And they're a means to an end. So I don't view them as negative or positive. I view them as, it is what it is. That's one of the things that I have to do to be able to live. Then the more creative pursuits that I have, it's deciding which ones are priority for you. So like I said, I wanted to start a podcast for years, and I started it 2 years ago. And I started on the back of my book when my book came out. And and that's what I put my attention into, and I still put some attention into it. And it's my work that actually funds my podcast. Because as you all know, particularly in Africa, but globally, very few people actually make real money off podcasts.
True.
Like if we're all going to be honest about it, right?
Yeah.
And monetizing a podcast on the African continent it's a very different prospect, and it's a harder prospect, and it's a longer term thing. So knowing that I'm not necessarily going to make money off my podcast, I have to work to be able to fund my podcast.
Yeah.
So I fund my podcast myself, right? So I book the studio, I book my guests, etc. If I need an assistant to help me do bookings, I have to pay them because they're not going to do it for the love of podcast.
Yeah.
So the thing that I do is I compartmentalize. So I know the things that I'm doing, which are about making a living and being able to live. And then there are my more creative projects, which I know they will generate revenue at some stage.
Yeah.
But I have to be in it for a longer haul. And so for me, it's how I've designed my life. So I've looked at my life holistically. So as opposed to just I work, or I'm a lawyer, or I'm a doctor, or I I have a particular job, and these are separate things that I'd love to do, but I can't do them because I need to work for a living. They all form part of my, let's call it my holistic life. They all form part of my portfolio. And in terms of trying to find balance and time for them, there's no balance. Sometimes there's alignment. Sometimes I have to put more attention on one because the need is greater. Knowing that, okay, I need to put attention into the work now, but I know that once this is done, I'm going to then shift my attention, the bulk of my attention, to my podcast, or I've been looking to do merchandising, any of the other kind of creative pursuits that I have.
Interesting. I like the fact that, well, I don't know if I should say I really like the fact that, but then it's a creative thing where we all sort of like are we tend to think twice about answering the question of what do you do, because as a creative you apply yourself into different fields. So this leads me to my next question, which is, on one hand you have creatives that are focused on one thing majorly and they're able to just have others, as the pseudo things that they focus on the other hand, you have creatives who are very talented and they try as much as they can to explore their creativity in many fields. Now, the challenge then comes with dealing with burnouts, and that leads me to my question. I want to assume that you've at one point or the other had to deal with burnouts. And I know this is something creatives deal with. Either it's burnout or creative block or stuff like this, where you're just in a standstill and you're losing that interest. So it's a question of how do you deal with burnout or the challenges that faces the creative block? How do you deal with such?
I'll go back to focusing on your life as a holistic thing, and recognizing that you need outlets outside of what you're doing as your main, let's call it, professional career. And I'm a big believer, for example, in hobbies, and being able to have things that can take you away from the pressure and the stress of a particular project or a particular situation or a particular pursuit, and allowing yourself that room. It seems simple, but it's an important thing. And yes, I mean, I at some stage of my life I was raised by a workaholic, so I felt like I never worked hard enough. And all that leads to is what you're talking about. It's burnout, whether it's a creative burnout, whether it's a physical burnout, emotional, mental. So the important thing is finding the things for yourself. Just take yourself out of and away from the pressure. And as I've gotten older, I've become much better at that. So I I also, I don't buy into the all I'm doing is working, whether it's I'm working on a creative project or whether it's I'm working in a job. And I try to carve out space for other things and other interests, whether it's reading, whether it's watching something. I I'm constantly trying different hobbies, for example, and like I grow bonsai trees now because I was always fascinated by it, and I want to try my hand at calligraphy, and also allowing myself the space. There's always work to be done, and often I'll feel like I have this very long to-do list, and I mean I give the example of my podcast. I haven't been able to be as consistent as I know I should be, and in my first year, I used to beat myself up about it. So it'd be the kind of the monkey I'm carrying on my shoulder when I'm doing any and everything. I'm thinking I haven't published an episode, I haven't recorded an episode, I haven't done anything with a podcast, and then like 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by, 4 weeks go by, and it's taking me a long time to get to the point where it's like, you know what, it's all right, because I'm doing the best that I can, and right now, I mean, so for example, right now I haven't published in about 2 3 weeks, but I have more work and I have more demands on my time. So I've had to kind of let that go, and it's hard. Like it
Yeah,
for all of us, it lingers, right?
yeah.
But I'm constantly reminding myself that, you know what, it's all right. I'm in this for the long haul, and right now it's just not possible, and that's also all right.
That's very relieving to hear. I mean, I feel relieved as a podcaster myself because a lot of time I also deal with that guilt of, oh, I haven't published. Like personally, right now, I haven't published an episode in. Okay, I missed a week actually. So okay, I'm gonna try to work on it. So how about just two questions before we call this a wrap? And the
Okay.
first question is, I'm curious to see how, you know, you've been able to apply how do I put it now? You've been in different creative spaces, from writing to TV to radio to magazine publishing, and you even have a business background, so these are different spaces, even though they have similarities. How have those different experiences that you gained and nurtured, how did they help you when you entered into another space? How did you bring them into that new space? Just give us an idea of how you kind of like married them into what you were doing at present without losing yourself in the new space.
It may sound a bit boring, but it's about the process and the systems you put in place. So the one thread for me that exists across all the different spaces I've interacted with is storytelling. So I tell stories. The medium is different, but I tell stories. And it's understanding is then, if I knowing that, it's then breaking down the process and the steps that you follow. So you have a podcast. What are the steps in creating a podcast, in a podcast episode? You need a guest. You need to be able to record it. You need to coordinate the time. You need to have it edited. You need to write your little blurb on what it's about. You need to if you have a flyer, you need to do a flyer on it. And then you need to publish it, and where you're going to publish it, what platform are you going to use. Once you know your hosting platform, they also have steps in terms of the stuff that you have to enter.
Yeah.
It's all just steps, right? So what I tend to do is look for the steps in a new space. So it's learning about, it's kind of learning about how the process works. The storytelling side is the stuff I'm comfortable with. So when I went to radio, for example, it was learning, it was learning the microphone. It was learning that when I'm having a conversation, I have a limited amount of time. So how I structure my questions, and also if I have a guest who's not forthcoming, how do I think on the fly and add questions? But in terms of the process, was learning how the board works. It was learning which button to press. And once I had an understanding of how that medium works, then it's just a matter of doing it. And coming from magazine, for example, where when I interview somebody, I'm interviewing somebody for a cover story. The interview runs for as long as it runs. And I'm not worried about how they answer. I'm not worried about if they've gone off on a tangent, because I'm going to sit and now consolidate all of that and write it. And my process is I transcribe the entire thing, and then I start picking out bits and pieces and moving it around like a puzzle. Now, when you're interviewing somebody, you're doing the same thing, but it also, you need to be able to control them. So you are thinking about time right now. So you also need to take that into consideration when I'm speaking.
Yeah.
And if I start going off at a tangent, you need to be able to bring me back within the constraints that you have. But at the core, everything is a process. Everything is a system.
Yeah. All right. That's a good one. And finally, my last question is, what advice would you give fellow creatives or even new creatives that are torn between their diverse interests?
I'll repeat myself, is give yourself space. I don't follow that advice often, but be kind to yourself. Also, decide, you don't have to do everything. So decide on the things that you're going to do. And some of them, you don't have to do everything. Not everything has to be monetized. Not everything has to be a business pursuit. So some of those things, you may want to do them just because you enjoy doing them. And you don't need to take it, you don't need to take it to its supposedly end conclusion as a business. And being able to kind of compartmentalize and decide which ones you're going to do, for a living, or which ones you're going to do to build a business around it, and which ones you're going to do just because you enjoy doing it.
Wow. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Kojo. And
Thank you.
just before we go, what's the name of your podcast and how can people find your podcast?
My podcast is Listen to Your Footsteps, and it's on all platforms that host podcasts. So from AfriPods to Spotify, Apple, etc.
Great. Listen to your footsteps. All about, talking about creativity, parenting, mental health, craft, writing, and all of those things that you talk about. Once again, thank you for being.
Sorry, you can also check my website. So my website, kojobaffoe.com. That's why I link to everything that I do. So it might actually be useful. I've tried to use that as a space to be able to create order. So people can go and look at that and borrow, steal, and get ideas about how to structure your own media ecosystem.
Okay, great. You heard it, guys. Go check him out on his website. And it's been beautiful having you on this discussant session, Kojo. And we just had a great time talking about navigating creativity across multiple fields of interest. That's it on this particular discussant session. Right now, we'll get back to the rest of the APVA Awards and let's find out who is winning what in what category. And we'll enjoy the rest of this award. Bye for now.